We like to think that we have conquered the world, mapping every valley and cataloging every grain of sand on our pale blue dot. But despite our satellites and sensors, the Earth remains a place of deep shadows and vast, inaccessible reaches that defy our understanding. What if the most fascinating inhabitants of our planet aren't the ones we see in zoos, but the ones that haven't been found yet? Throughout history, whispers of giant, elusive creatures have echoed from the highest peaks of the Himalayas to the densest jungles of the Amazon. These are the cryptids, beings that exist in the tantalizing boundary between folklore and biology, challenging our definition of what is actually real. For decades, stories of the Yeti have captivated the human imagination, described as a massive, ape-like wanderer of the unforgiving, frozen, lunar-like heights. In the Buddhist monasteries of the high mountains, the Yeti is not a myth, but a spiritual reality, a guardian of the sacred wilderness. Western fascination exploded in the mid-20th century, when explorers returned with photographs of oversized footprints pressed into the pristine, high-altitude snow. These tracks, sometimes nearly double the size of a human foot, suggested a creature of immense weight and specialized adaptation to the thin air. But as we look closer, the line between a biological discovery and a psychological projection begins to blur in the shimmering mountain mist. Why do we want these creatures to exist so badly that we see their shapes in every moving shadow and every snapped branch? Perhaps it is because a world that is fully known feels smaller, less magical, and far more lonely than a world with secrets. To investigate the mystery of the Yeti, we must leave the comfort of our cities and venture into the most extreme environments on Earth. These regions are so remote and dangerous that a large mammal could, in theory, remain hidden from the prying eyes of modern civilization. Scientists have long argued that the fossil record contains many ghost lineages, species that existed for millions of years but left no traces behind. Could the Yeti be a remnant of a prehistoric past, a surviving branch of the primate family tree that took a different evolutionary path? In the 1950s, the hunt became official, with expeditions funded by wealthy benefactors and even sanctioned by governments eager for a breakthrough. They brought cameras, traps, and even bloodhounds, hoping to bring back a specimen that would change biology textbooks forever and stun the world. What they found instead were fragments of hair, scraps of skin, and a collection of stories that grew more complex with every passing year. Today, we use the tools of the 21st century to scan these relics, searching for the molecular signature of a legend hidden in DNA. To understand the Yeti, we have to look at the giants that actually walked the Earth not so long ago. Meet Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest ape to ever exist, standing 3 meters tall and weighing over 500 kilograms. This real-life monster lived in the forests of Southeast Asia for nearly 2 million years before vanishing into the fossil record. While the timing is tight, some wonder if the memory of these massive primates survived through the oral traditions of early humans. But the Himalayas are not a hospitable place for a tropical giant. It is a world of vertical drops and freezing winds. For a species to survive here, it would need a metabolism of iron and a coat thick enough to repel the void. Modern science has a powerful new way to check for these hidden neighbors: environmental DNA, or eDNA, pulled from the soil. By sampling a single cup of river water or a handful of dirt, we can detect every creature that passed by. In 2014, a major study led by Professor Brian Sykes of Oxford University analyzed dozens of alleged Yeti hair samples. The results were grounded in reality. Most belonged to bears, cows, horses, and even a few surprisingly adventurous dogs. One specific result sparked a brief fire of excitement: a match for a prehistoric polar bear from the Pleistocene epoch. Could an ancient, unrecognized species of bear be the true identity of the legend roaming the high Tibetan plateaus? This bear Yeti theory bridges the gap between myth and biology, suggesting we are seeing a real animal through a distorted lens. Yet, even with DNA evidence pointing toward known animals, the eyewitness accounts continue to pour in from remote villages. Psychologists suggest that in high-stress, low-oxygen environments, the human brain is prone to pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. When you are exhausted and freezing, a shifting shadow on a rock face can easily become a crouching, hairy beast. We are storytelling animals. We prefer a monster in the dark to the terrifying realization that we are completely alone. But the Yeti isn't the only ghost in the woods. Across the ocean, another legend stalks the Pacific Northwest. Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, represents a different kind of mystery, one nested in the deep, emerald cathedrals of the temperate rainforest. Here, the evidence isn't just footprints and hair, but a famous, grainy film that has been debated for over half a century. In 1967, at Bluff Creek, California, two men captured 60 seconds of footage that would spark a global obsession. The Patterson-Gimlin film shows a large, hairy humanoid walking with a distinctive, heavy stride before glancing back at the camera. For over 50 years, experts in biomechanics and Hollywood special effects have analyzed every frame of this shaky, grainy sequence. Some point to the visible ripple of muscles and the non-human gait as evidence that this was no man in a suit. Others argue that the technology of the 60s was more than capable of creating a sophisticated primate costume for a hoax. But the Bigfoot legend isn't just about one film. It is rooted in the deep history of indigenous peoples across the continent. Long before European settlers arrived, nations like the Lummi and Salish spoke of Tsemaquez, the wild man of the woods. To these cultures, Bigfoot was not a monster to be hunted, but a powerful, supernatural entity that lived in the spirit world. Science, however, demands physical proof: a bone, a tooth, or a clear genetic sequence that doesn't match any known species. If a breeding population of 1,000-pound primates existed in North America, why haven't we found a single skeleton or carcass? Unlike the high Himalayas, the forests of the Northwest are teeming with hikers, hunters, and high-definition trail cameras. Statistically, the missing body problem is the greatest hurdle for Bigfoot's biological reality in the modern, connected world. Yet, believers point to the Bigfoot of the Amazon, the Mapinguari, which offers a terrifyingly different set of physical clues. In the dense jungles of Brazil, locals describe a massive, red-furred beast with a mouth on its belly and a stench that paralyzes. While the belly mouth is likely mythological flair, the description of the creature's thick, armored hide sounds remarkably familiar to paleontologists. It perfectly matches the giant ground sloth Megatherium, a behemoth that was supposed to have gone extinct 10,000 years ago. Could some of these extinct megafauna have survived in the deep, unexplored pockets of the world's largest tropical rainforest? This brings us to a fundamental question. How well do we really know the biodiversity of our own planet's wilderness? Every year, we discover thousands of new species, though most are tiny insects or deep-sea organisms hidden in the abyss. But as the world gets louder and brighter, these ancient legends seem to be retreating further into the edges of the map. The disappearance of a large species is rarely a clean break. It is a slow, quiet, fading into the background noise of the ecosystem. In biology, the Lazarus effect describes a species that seems to rise from the dead after being declared extinct for millions of years. Consider the coelacanth, a prehistoric fish thought to have perished with the dinosaurs until it was pulled from a fishing net in 1938. If a 6-foot fish could hide in the ocean, why do we find it so impossible for a giant primate to hide in a mountain? The answer lies in the harsh math of calories and population density required for a large mammal to survive and breed. A creature the size of a yeti would need a massive amount of food, leaving behind clear signs of foraging and waste. Yet, in the most remote corners of the Bhutanese highlands, the migoi is still reported by herdsmen who know the wildlife intimately. These witnesses are not tourists looking for a thrill. They are people who can distinguish a bear from a wolf at a mile. To dismiss their accounts entirely is to ignore a form of human data that has guided our survival for thousands of years. But if these creatures are real, their existence is likely more fragile than any myth, threatened by the same world that fears them. Every road carved into a hillside and every forest cleared for timber shrinks the hiding space for the giants of our legends. Science often acts as a cold shower for our imagination, replacing monsters with misidentified bears and blurry optical illusions. We found that yeti skin in a monastery was actually the hide of a Himalayan brown bear, a rare but known predator. This bear can stand on its hind legs and walk with a terrifyingly human-like posture, especially when it is curious or threatened. It seems our ancestors took a real, dangerous animal and transformed it into a supernatural boogeyman to keep children away from the cliffs. But the existence of the bear doesn't explain the universal nature of the wild man myth found in almost every human culture. From the Enkidu of ancient Mesopotamia to the Grendel of Beowulf, we have always been obsessed with a mirror version of ourselves. The wild man represents our own untamed past, a version of humanity that never built walls or learned how to control fire. He is the shadow of our civilization, reminding us that we were once part of the brutal, beautiful cycle of the wild. As we look toward the future, we must decide if we want to live in a world where everything is explained and categorized. Beyond the physical reality of bones and hair lies a deeper question. Why does the human mind keep creating these giants? Anthropologists call this the relict hominoid phenomenon, the persistent belief that we are not the only survivors of our lineage. Millions of years ago, the Earth was home to multiple species of humans and great apes living simultaneously in overlapping territories. We shared the landscape with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the tiny hobbits of Flores, making the world a crowded, diverse place. Then, quite suddenly, in geological terms, they all vanished, leaving us as the lonely, sole representatives of the Homo genus. Perhaps the legends of Bigfoot and the Yeti are ancestral echoes, ghostly memories of the others we once feared or befriended. Modern technology has allowed us to map the genetic ghosts of these lost cousins inside our own DNA strands today. If their genetic code survived within us, is it so hard to imagine their stories survived in our oldest campfire tales? In the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, we find a legend that describes a small, bipedal primate living in the volcanic jungles. Local people distinguish it clearly from the orangutan, describing a creature that walks upright and possesses an almost human face. This sounds strikingly similar to Homo floresiensis, a species that science only discovered in 2003 through fossils in a limestone cave. This discovery shocked the scientific world because it proved that mythical small humans were real until at least 50,000 years ago. If science can be surprised by a physical discovery in the 21st century, what else remains hidden in the deep green? The problem with cryptids is that they require us to prove a negative to prove that something definitely does not exist. But you can never fully prove a negative. You can only increase the statistical likelihood that a hiding place is empty. As our thermal cameras and satellite imagery improve, the statistical hiding room for a large terrestrial mammal is shrinking to zero. We have reached a point where the mystery is shifting from the woods into the complex architecture of the human brain. Neurologists have found that certain types of electrical stimulation can induce the sensation of a sensed presence in an empty room. In the silence of the wilderness, our brains might be hardwired to populate the emptiness with the faces of our ancestors. We are a species that hates a vacuum, especially a biological one, so we fill the gaps with monsters and gods. If the giants of our past have truly left the physical world, they have found a permanent home in our collective psychology. To understand why, we must look at the Wood Wide Web, the intricate network of life that connects every living thing in the forest. In this dense biological architecture, a large creature doesn't just exist, it functions as a critical node in the energy flow. The absence of such a node, the apex primate, leaves a structural gap that our minds seem desperate to fill with meaning. Ecology tells us that every niche is eventually occupied, yet the niche for a high-altitude bipedal ape remains stubbornly vacant. Some researchers suggest that the Yeti is actually a placeholder for the unknown dangers of the high-altitude frontier. It is a personification of the avalanche, the hypoxia, and the bone-chilling cold that claims the lives of the unwary. By giving the mountain a face, we make the impersonal forces of nature something we can bargain with or understand. But as we strip away the myth, we find that the real inhabitants of these regions are equally strange and marvelous. We find the snow leopard, a ghost of the mountain that is so elusive it was once thought to be a legend itself. If a cat the size of a human can remain invisible for decades, why is the idea of a hidden ape so offensive to science? The difference is one of biology. Cats are solitary, low-impact predators, while large primates are social and high-resource consumers. A social group of Bigfoots would leave a trail of DNA and destruction that even the most primitive technology could detect. This brings us to the interdimensional theory, a fringe idea that these creatures aren't hiding in the woods, but between worlds. While this makes for great science fiction, it serves as a get-out-of-jail-free card for the lack of physical evidence. In the Kurzgesagt view of the universe, we prefer explanations that stay within the beautiful, rigid laws of physics and biology. If the Yeti is real, it must eat, it must sleep, and most importantly, it must eventually leave behind a physical body. The fact that we have found thousands of prehistoric bird bones but zero Bigfoot bones is a mathematical tragedy for the legend. We are left with a choice. Do we follow the cold path of the data or the warm, inviting glow of the campfire story? Perhaps the most scientific approach is to admit that while the evidence is thin, the mystery itself serves a vital human purpose. If we stop looking for monsters in the physical world, we might start finding them in the mirrors of our own history. Consider the Flores hobbit, a creature so small and strange it was dismissed as a fairy tale until its bones were found in 2003. This tiny human, Homo floresiensis, lived on a remote Indonesian island and stood only 3 feet tall with a brain the size of a grapefruit. Local legends spoke of the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy, forest dwellers who stole food and spoke in a mumble. For the first time, science had to confront a terrifying possibility. The myth was actually a biological memory of a coexisting species. This discovery shifted the paradigm, suggesting that our ancestors' stories weren't just imaginative fiction, but primitive field observations. If the Hobbit was real, why do we find it so difficult to accept that a giant might have been real too? The answer is scale. A small population of tiny humans on an island is much easier to hide than a 1,000-pound titan. In North America, the search for Bigfoot has moved from the forest floor into the high-tech laboratories of geneticists. In 2012, a controversial study claimed to have sequenced the Bigfoot genome, suggesting a hybrid of human and an unknown primate. But when independent labs reviewed the data, the mystery DNA turned out to be a messy cocktail of human, opossum, and cow. This is the tragedy of the search. Every time we think we have a smoking gun, it turns out to be a dirty lens. Yet, the lack of evidence doesn't stop the sightings. Thousands of people every year report seeing something they cannot explain. Are they all lying? Or is there a biological glitch in our visual system that makes us see ape men in the trees? Our ancestors survived by being hypersensitive to movement. Those who saw a beast that wasn't there lived longer than those who missed the real one. We are the descendants of the paranoid, the ones whose brains are wired to find faces and intent in the random chaos of nature. This hyperactive agency detection is the engine that drives both our religions and our most persistent monster legends. We look at a dark forest and our brain asks, "Who is there?" rather than "What is there?" assuming life is always watching. To a scientist, the forest is a system of energy. To the human soul, the forest is a theater of ancient, hidden actors. This tension between what we can measure and what we can feel is the true birthplace of the Bigfoot and the Yeti. If we want to find the real Yeti, we have to follow the trail of the most successful high-altitude predator, the bear. Recent DNA analysis of Yeti relics in private collections has almost exclusively pointed to the Himalayan brown bear and the Tibetan blue bear. To a casual observer, these bears are just animals, but in the thin, hallucinogenic air of the peaks, they become something more. A bear standing on its hind legs to get a better view can look uncannily like a massive, shaggy human in the twilight. Its footprints, when melted and refrozen in the snow, expand and distort into the giant, elongated tracks that fueled decades of expeditions. This is the bear hypothesis, the idea that the Yeti is a biological reality seen through a filter of cultural expectation and physical exhaustion. But while this explains the physical evidence, it doesn't explain the profound emotional impact these sightings have on the witnesses. We are a species that lives in a world of stories, and sometimes the story is more important than the species itself. In North America, the search for Sasquatch has transformed into a massive subculture with its own rules, language, and citizen scientists. They use thermal optics, parabolic microphones, and complex statistical models to predict where a giant primate might hide. They have mapped out Bigfoot hotspots, which curiously overlap almost perfectly with areas of high forest density and low human interference. Yet, these are also the areas where black bears are most common, creating a persistent signal-to-noise problem for researchers. If you go into the woods looking for a monster, your brain will work overtime to ensure that you find one. This is confirmation bias at a planetary scale. We find what we seek, especially when the seeking gives our lives a sense of adventure. But what if the Bigfoot isn't an animal at all, but a manifestation of our deep-seated guilt over destroying the natural world? By imagining a giant, invincible guardian of the forest, we create a hero who can survive even if we fail to protect the trees. He is the Green Man of the Industrial Age, a symbol of a nature that refuses to be tamed or categorized by our spreadsheets. As we move deeper into the age of extinction, these legends act as a kind of psychological insurance policy for our planet. If there is still a monster in the woods, it means the woods are still big enough, wild enough, and deep enough to matter. But the hard truth of biology is that no species can survive on myth alone. It needs a habitat, a food source, and a mate. If a hidden species of giant ape truly exists, it must obey the laws of population genetics to avoid the trap of extinction. For a population to remain healthy over thousands of years, it needs a minimum of several hundred individuals to maintain genetic diversity. This minimum viable population means that we aren't looking for one lonely monster, but a massive, hidden civilization of giants. Hundreds of thousand-pound creatures would require a territory larger than some small countries just to find enough seasonal calories. In the Pacific Northwest, this would mean a constant interaction with the edges of our expanding suburban sprawl and highway networks. Biologists point out that we have captured high-resolution footage of every other large mammal in North America using automated trail cameras. From the elusive mountain lion to the rare wolverine, our digital net is fine enough to catch even the most cautious predators. The fact that Bigfoot only appears in blurry, low-quality images is a phenomenon known in skeptical circles as Pisnarski's law. It suggests that the perceived mystery is inversely proportional to the resolution of the camera being used at the time. Yet, the mystery of the Mapinguari in the Amazon persists because the terrain itself is a biological fortress that guards its secrets. The Amazon rainforest is so vast and vertical that entire tribes of uncontacted humans still live there, completely unknown to the state. If we can lose entire groups of our own species in the green abyss, could a prehistoric ground sloth truly be hiding there? Paleontologists have found that the megafauna of South America survived much longer than those in the north, perhaps until quite recently. The red fur, the thick skin, and the terrifying claws described by locals match the extinct Mylodon with haunting, scientific accuracy. This is where the legend feels most grounded, not as a supernatural ghost, but as a biological relic from a forgotten epoch. But even in the Amazon, the sounds of chainsaws and the glow of gold mining camps are reaching the most untouchable sectors. If the Mapinguari is real, we may be discovering it at the exact moment we are ensuring its final, permanent disappearance. This is the great irony of cryptozoology. We hunt for these creatures to prove they exist, but our presence destroys the silence they need. We are like observers in quantum physics. The very act of looking at the mystery changes the state of the mystery itself. Perhaps the only way for these giants to survive is for us to never find the proof we so desperately seek. The search for hidden species often forces us to look at the dark matter of biology, the things we know are there but cannot see. In the world of science, we call these cryptic species animals that look identical to our eyes but are genetically worlds apart. What if the Yeti isn't a different shape but a different branch of a known animal that has adapted to the impossible? Evolution is a master of disguise, capable of turning a common bear into a mountain ghost through thousands of years of isolation. But as we scan the high-altitude peaks with thermal satellites, the places to hide are being erased by a grid of heat and light. We are effectively shrinking the world, leaving no room for the monsters that once populated the edges of our maps. This loss of mystery has a profound effect on the human spirit, which evolved to wonder about what lies beyond the next ridge. If we know every square inch of the planet, we lose the curiosity engine that drove our ancestors to cross oceans and climb mountains. In the Amazon, researchers are using drones to map the canopy, peering through the green ceiling that once hid the Mapinguari. They find hidden waterfalls and uncatalogued plants, but the giant red-furred sloth remains a phantom of the digital age. Anthropology suggests that many of these legends are actually ecological warnings, encoded in the form of a scary story. The Mapinguari's stench and impenetrable skin might be a metaphor for the toxic, dangerous depths of the primary jungle. By respecting the legend of the monster, ancient people were actually practicing a primitive form of forest conservation and safety. If you believe a giant protector lives in the grove, you are less likely to overhunt or destroy the habitat for short-term gain. In this way, the myth acts as a biological shield, protecting the real biodiversity from the greed of the storytelling animal. But modern civilization doesn't believe in shields made of stories. It only believes in data, resources, and expansion. We are currently living through the sixth extinction, where species are vanishing faster than we can even give them names. If a Bigfoot or a Yeti were discovered tomorrow, their first interaction with humanity would likely be a struggle for survival. The real tragedy isn't that they might be fake, but that if they were real, we would have nowhere left to put them. We are building a world that is perfectly understood, perfectly mapped, and perhaps perfectly lonely for a species like us. Even if we never find a body, the wild man remains the ultimate metaphor for the untamed corners of our own DNA. Every few years, a new video emerges, sparking a viral wildfire of speculation before being extinguished by expert analysis. These hoaxes aren't just tricks. They are a form of performance art that reflects our desperate need for the world to be bigger. In the 1920s, a miner named Albert Ostman claimed he was kidnapped by a family of Sasquatch and held captive for 6 days. His detailed descriptions of their diet and social behavior sounded remarkably consistent with what we now know about great ape biology. But without a single physical artifact, his story remains a ghost, trapped in the same limbo as every other eyewitness account. Modern skeptics point to mass psychogenic illness, where groups of people experience the same hallucination due to shared cultural belief. If everyone in a valley grew up hearing stories of the Yeti, they are biologically primed to see him in the fog. This creates a closed loop of evidence where the myth generates the sightings and the sightings reinforce the myth. However, cryptozoology is occasionally redeemed by the zebra of the forest, the okapi, which was once considered a myth. For centuries, Europeans laughed at stories of a half-zebra, half-giraffe hiding in the Congo, until it was finally classified in 1901. The okapi serves as the patron saint of the believers, proof that the jungle can hide a large, beautiful animal for a long time. But the okapi lived in the heart of Africa, a place that was, at the time, a total black hole on Western maps. Today, there are no more black holes. There is only the grey of the industrial sprawl and the blue of the satellite beam. If we want to keep the mystery alive, we have to protect the environments that make that mystery biologically possible. The survival of the Bigfoot legend is inextricably linked to the survival of the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. When we lose the last patch of ancient timber, we don't just lose wood, we lose the habitat of the imagination. We are the only species that creates its own monsters, perhaps to remind us that we aren't as powerful as we think. A world without a Yeti is a world where humanity has no more rivals, no more equals, and no more surprises. As we peer into the darkness of the trees, we aren't just looking for an ape, we are looking for a part of ourselves. To solve the riddle of the giants, we must look at the ghost of evolution, the species that almost made it. In the dry caves of South China, we find the teeth of the real Yeti Gigantopithecus long after the creature itself has turned to dust. These massive molars tell a story of a specialized vegetarian giant that fell victim to a changing climate and a shrinking forest. As the bamboo forests vanished, so did the giants, leaving behind only the smaller, more adaptable primates like us. This is a recurring theme in the history of life. The bigger you are, the harder it is to hide from extinction. Yet, the human heart rebels against this finality, searching for a loophole in the laws of biology and thermodynamics. We imagine thermal refugia, hidden pockets of warmth and food where the ancient rules of the Ice Age still apply. In the Pacific Northwest, these refugia take the form of deep volcanic valleys that are nearly impossible for humans to traverse. Here, the believers argue that a small population could survive by being nocturnal, nomadic, and highly intelligent. If they are smart enough to avoid our traps, perhaps they are also smart enough to bury their dead and hide their waste. But intelligence requires a massive brain, and a massive brain requires a massive, constant supply of high-quality protein. This is the biological tax that every primate must pay, and it is a tax that is very difficult to hide from a forest survey. Even the most secretive mountain gorillas leave a human footprint of fire, tools, and altered vegetation that satellites can see. The fact that we see none of these markers for Bigfoot suggests that the wild man is a master of a different kind of camouflage. It is the camouflage of the mind, a memory of our own wildness that we project onto the canvas of the deep woods. In the Amazon, the mapinguari is said to be immune to bullets, having skin as tough as the armor of a medieval knight. This matches the osteoderm's tiny bony plates found in the skin of the extinct giant ground sloth, making them biological tanks. If such a tank still roams the rainforest, it is a living fossil that has survived by being too tough for the world to eat. But even the toughest armor cannot protect a species from the invisible, shifting boundaries of a warming planet. We are finding that the monsters we should be most afraid of are the ones we see in the mirror every morning. If we are to be the final judges of these legends, we must ask, what would it actually mean to find them? Discovery is often the death of mystery, replacing a majestic, living myth with a catalogued specimen in a cold museum drawer. Once we define the Yeti's metabolism and the Sasquatch's genome, they stop being guardians of the wild and become just another endangered species. We have a long history of loving creatures into extinction, turning them into commodities, trophies, or objects of clinical observation. Perhaps the reason they remain hidden is that the world is no longer safe for anything that doesn't serve a human purpose. Science is our most powerful tool for understanding reality, but it can also be a cage that limits our sense of wonder. In the Himalayas, the Yeti continues to inspire a profound respect for the high-altitude wilderness that no datasheet could ever replicate. It keeps the mountains alive in the minds of the people, ensuring that the peaks are treated as sacred ground rather than just rocks. In the modern West, Bigfoot has become a secular myth for an age that has largely abandoned traditional folklore and monsters. He is the ultimate rebel, living off the grid and refusing to be captured by our high-definition, always connected society. To many, he represents a dream of freedom, the possibility that something can still exist completely outside of the human system. But the system is closing in, as real-time satellite monitoring and AI-driven image analysis leave no shadow unprobed. We are entering an era of radical transparency, where the hidden world is becoming a mathematical impossibility on our planet. If a large creature wants to survive our attention, it may have to evolve into something that our technology simply cannot see. But biology has its limits. A heart must beat, and a body must displace the air, creating a signal that physics will always find. This is the tragedy of the biological cryptid. It is trapped in a world that is becoming too small for its own footprints. Yet, even as the physical giants fade, the idea of them grows stronger, populating our films, our books, and our dreams. We need the wild man to remind us of the boundary between the civilization we built and the nature we came from. Without that boundary, we risk forgetting that we are also animals, subject to the same laws of ecology and extinction. The mystery of the Yeti and Bigfoot isn't just about them, it's about our own desire to remain curious in a world of answers. The story of the giants is ultimately a story about the boundaries of the human map and the limits of our own ego. We have always needed a wild man to define what it means to be civilized, a mirror to show us our own reflection. In the deep past, the world was filled with others, cousins with heavy brows and different ways of seeing the stars. We shared the fire and the hunt, and then we watched as they slowly faded into the long night of extinction. Perhaps we keep looking for the Yeti because we are still grieving for the siblings we lost on our journey to the present. This evolutionary loneliness drives us to populate the empty forests with ghosts that look and walk just like we do. But science reminds us that if we want to find life, we must look at the reality of the soil and the data. Every leaf that falls and every drop of water in a mountain stream carries the genetic history of everything that lives there. As we sequence the world, we find that the monsters are actually beautiful, known animals doing the hard work of survival. The Himalayan bear and the Amazonian sloth are not disappointments compared to the myth. They are the real, breathing miracles. They have survived the rise of our civilization, finding ways to endure in the shrinking pockets of the truly wild. By chasing a myth, we might accidentally save a reality, protecting habitats that house thousands of species we already know. If a forest is big enough for Bigfoot, it is big enough for the rare birds, the insects, and the ancient trees. The legend acts as an umbrella, shielding the entire ecosystem from the storm of industrial progress and blind expansion. But we must be careful not to value the mystery more than the life that actually manages to exist in these places. A world that is too small for a 1,000-pound ape is a world that is becoming too dangerous for everything else. As our cities glow brighter, we must ask if we are prepared for the silence that comes when every mystery is solved. We are the makers of our own reality, choosing which stories to believe and which truths to ignore in the dark. The search for the Yeti and the Sasquatch is a testament to the fact that we still haven't lost our sense of play. Even in an age of satellites and AI, we still hope that something massive is watching us from the edge of the trees. So, as we stand at the edge of the final frontier of our own planet, what have we actually learned? We have learned that while the giants might not be walking beside us, they are living inside us. They are the biological echoes of our extinct cousins and the psychological guardians of the forests we still have left. Science has given us the tools to debunk the hoaxes, but it hasn't given us a reason to stop looking. In a universe that is mostly cold, dead space, the mystery of life on Earth is the greatest story ever told. Whether it's a bear, a sloth, or an undiscovered primate, the fact that something is out there matters. It reminds us that we are still part of a vast, complex, and beautiful web that we didn't weave. Every time we choose to protect a wilderness, we are keeping a piece of the ancient mystery alive. We are ensuring that the next generation still has a dark forest to peer into with wonder and fear. Perhaps the Yeti and Bigfoot are waiting for us to become wise enough to share the planet with them. Or perhaps they are simply the way our ancestors taught us to respect the power of the unknown. In the end, the evidence might be weak, but the human need for the wild man is indestructible. We will keep searching, not just for a body, but for the feeling of being small in a big world. We will keep setting up cameras and sequencing DNA, hoping for a surprise that changes everything we know. Because a world that is perfectly explained is a world where the adventure has finally come to an end. And if there is one thing that defines our species, it is that we are never quite finished with the adventure.